Yeah, I'd like to thank the examiners for taking the time to listen to my presentation and read my dissertation. And I'd also like to thank my supervisors, Graham, Christ and Roger Kemp, for their supervision over the last 3.5 years. Also to thank the PRS panels for their advice and guidance over the last 3 to 4 years. And also then thank the people of District 4 for their contribution to my work. So back in 2016, I started a research project with some colleagues from RMIT, and we knew that we wanted to look at hems, but my experience of these hems, which are basically these alleyways in Ho Chi Minh City, my experience of these hems was really focused around District 1, District 3, which tend to be more commercialised and perhaps more tourist orientated in some places as well. So we kind of looked around and we decided we would look at District 4 because it's relatively close to the campus, which would make it easy access for us as researchers, but also because it was a district that was pretty much cut off from the rest of the city in terms that it was seen as being a bit of a dodgy area. It was seen as being dirty and very working class. So a lot of the middle class Vietnamese tend to really look down their nose. The reality obviously couldn't be further from the truth. It's one of the friendliest areas I've been to in the city, and it's spotlessly clean, and all of the gangs and the issues, the gang-related crime no longer exists here. It moved out probably about 10 years ago now. They were all moved out. So when I first came here, the whole space was very kind of overwhelming. It's very intense, as you can see. It's very narrow, it's very condensed, and it's very busy. Motorbikes, push bikes, people walking up and down constantly. So the whole experience was very overwhelming, and that's something that's been an experience from that hasn't really changed. No matter how much I've got used to being here, experience hasn't changed. What has changed is my knowledge of my visual knowledge of the hems has obviously increased a lot. There's a lot culturally and just in the way certain things happen that I'm constantly learning, and that's because I'm not Vietnamese, I'm not resident, so my understanding of what goes on in these spaces is purely based on observation. So my whole PhD really has been, the key focus of it has been about this intense and durational kind of observation, where I've been filming the same set of hems for the last 4 years. Even as we arrive, there are kind of people that remember me coming and say hello. One of the films I made is Mechanic, and that's this guy here. So a lot of things are very similar. I mean, this door appears in a lot of films, but then there are kind of new developments. So some of the buildings down here are kind of new, have been built in the during the process of the PhD. So the thing's changing. It's very live. It's very fresh. It's a very kind of it's an area that's not sort of it's an area that is all about change and redevelopment, but micro redevelopments rather than the whole scale redevelopments you see in District 1 and District 3, District 2. One of the advantages of looking at this as an outsider is that I'm able to, I don't have any preconceived ideas about what is happening here. I don't have any, I don't know who are the dodgy people, who are the friendly people. I mean, to be honest, everybody I've met has been very friendly. But so I have no preconceived ideas. I have no preconceived approach. So that the whole of the filming, one of the core principles of the filming process has been to actually just film what I experience. So being here, what is it like? And I will just plonk the camera down and either record a series of sequences or a long sequence, or I'll walk around with a gimbal and film that process of walking around and I just film what I come across. I have no intention, I have no reason to go out and film anything in particular, or film any particular place or any particular thing that I'm looking for. And this is something that I was a taught thing. When I first started this project, I really didn't know how to capture this. I didn't know how to try and film spaces which are so tight, so intense, so noisy, busy, active spaces. So what I tended to focus on were the kind of the traces of activity. So I started looking at the scratches and the marks and the handprints and all of the things that the kind of the ephemeral data information in these hems. So looking at where the sunlight hit, where the shadows were, and scratches on the walls, the drips of paint, things like that. But what I began to realize is, of course, this was all very interesting, but it didn't really reflect here. It sort of, not necessarily could have been anywhere, but it wasn't necessarily reflective of here. So I then started to sort of think about filming, just putting the camera down and filming sequences. And I started filming a series of 3 to 5 minute sequences. And again, you know, these were good, but they were kind of based on my understanding of how to make films from when I was in London. So what I thought would be more interesting is to then start looking at really long shots. So you get a durational period of time and you see a series of events that happen over a period of time. And so then that involved me putting the camera down and filming for as long as the camera would film, or walking around with the gimbal and filming as long as the camera would film. So I kind of relied on the technology to basically trip over itself and finish the filming. But that usually gave me sequences of around about 15 to 20 minutes in the single sequence, in which I was able to kind of really begin to see the subtlety of kind of interactions between movement and space and the activities and the events that people do inside these hens, just their everyday activities. Most of which are kind of commerce orientated, so a lot of food, fruit, and veg. Some people turn their houses, their ground floors into small businesses, and they live on above. Fairly common way of operating. But all of these things kind of begin to kind of reveal themselves through the time. But then what I found is that what the camera does, the camera only captures a certain amount. So we're in a space at the moment where we've got a lot of information going on in front of us, and there's a lot of information going on behind us. But the camera can only capture one at a time. And so what I wanted to do was start to develop a set of lenses and filters, ways of treating the footage that began to try and extract more of the qualitative properties of these spaces. So it would be sort of finding small details, small things that began to emerge just through looking and re-looking at the footage. So my knowledge of these spaces is one kind of experiential, where I'm kind of walking around, but most of my knowledge comes from just continually re-looking at the footage that I've captured. And I found that the durational sequences really helped with that process of re-looking. I think primarily the audience for this will be people who are kind of obviously interested in Vietnam, interested in in our cities and how we how this city operates. But I'm also kind of for me, this is a document which is valuable for it's valuable in terms that it's telling a qualitative story of these spaces, which enshrines the culture and the way of life of these spaces, which is not really that appreciated here in Vietnam. I mean, people talk nostalgically about living in Hems because a lot of people still remember growing up in Hems. But the wealthier the population becomes, they're moving into apartment blocks and into areas that are less areas that don't have these qualities, and so they tend to they're losing touch with it. So this is a document that records the culture and the way these spaces operate. Not that they're under imminent threat of demolition, but there's a lot of pressure to redevelop these areas because they're not seen as being modern. The government doesn't want Vietnam to be seen in this light. It wants it to be seen in something that looks like kind of Singapore, I guess. They want it to be a modern, vibrant Asian city. Rather than this, which perhaps is seen as being a bit kind of old-fashioned, perhaps not the wealthy kind of side of Vietnam that maybe politicians like to present. So I think this document is a document that will I'm hoping it's a document that will also kind of be picked up and used by the professionals, by the the architects, the planners, the urban designers, to understand how Vietnamese people operate, because these spaces tend to be a reflection of the mindset of the Vietnamese population. They're almost a kind of a mirror of how Vietnamese people think and operate. Everything is very fast. They can do everything and anything, and very rarely do you hear the answer no or can't be done. They always find a way of being able to kind of make things happen, and these spaces kind of reflect that, where everything is utilized. Everything is, a tree over there becomes painted yellow to kind of and it's a little shrine, and you can see people's houses here, which are kind of a house built behind a house. And so they kind of manage to utilize and work with these spaces in a way that's highly efficient. And so these spaces have these kind of overlapping and layered kind of uses, and there's no space that goes unwasted. There's very efficient use of space. And when you look at most modern apartment blocks, which is what I live in, you can see lots of space that is just wasted because there's no understanding of how to design efficient spaces. And so maybe maybe this kind of collection of films can give an insight into perhaps how we need to work in a much or live and operate in a much more condensed environment for a whole number of reasons. The massive population shift from countryside to city is going to demand that. And this idea of having big spaces is going to be harder and harder. My way of the kind of set of methods that I've developed to work in this area very much reflect the process of being here and now and being in this context, in this environment. Walking around and filming these kind of spaces. And my intention is that I have no preconceived idea of how I'm going to treat these things. So I have a set of lenses and filters which I work on in the post-production phase. And in part that's as a trigger for myself to make me look harder and closer at the footage that I capture. But at this moment in time, I don't. I just enjoy the experience and just look at the multitude of things that there are to look at. And it won't be until I actually go back, and that process starts when I jump on the back of a motorbike and start going back to my studio, that then the experience that I've just had starts to kind of filter through, and I start to begin to sort of order it into my brain. And then when I get back to the studio, I can re-look through the footage, keep re-looking. And then I start playing with it. I'll start playing with blur, or I'll start layering things up to intensify the colors. Then I'll notice certain things and I'll sort of think, well, that would be quite interesting. Maybe if I extruded those, or if I built them up as layers and just overlaid and then did a slight time delay on each layer, just so that I can begin to kind of try to build the experience of a kind of qualitative experience of being here, rather than it being one of photographic accuracy in terms of being a plain straight document, which, as I said, because the camera doesn't capture the 360 degrees, it loses so much. Whereas I find when I start playing with these treatments, they become closer to the experience of being here. The kind of the noises, the smells. There's chicken going on over there. There's people cooking lunch here. It's like a kind of cafe. So, you know, again, the hem now has become like a kind of a dining room or a cafe. It's this kind of multiple shifting of use that kind of is I find really really fascinating. And it's not unique to Vietnam. It's kind of, I guess it happens all over Asia. But hello.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
How are you? What's your name?
Andy.
Andy.
Yeah.
Wang.
Wong.
How are you?
I'm fine, yeah. Good. Hmm? Australian? No, English.
Name
Yeah.
what?
English, yeah.
Name Wang.
Yeah, that's right. So again, that's kind of like the you know why this space is kind of really fascinating, because it's, you know, you've got a 65-year-old guy sitting in the middle of District 4, which is kind of a relatively isolated district within the city, and he can speak English. So where does that where does that come from? But this is a typical example of where someone has taken their house and then it becomes like a workshop on the ground floor, and then they live above. And so again, you know, these hems again are a reflection of a kind of mentality or mindset that's very kind of, again, you could argue maybe Asian, but certainly in the context I'm in at the moment, I just look at this as say it's Vietnamese, but where the space is a reflection. Hi, the space is a reflection of the mindset and the approach of Vietnamese people who work exceptionally hard and you know, operate 6 days a week. But you even come here on a Sunday, it will still be relatively busy, even though that's more of a family day. But perhaps the hems will be a bit more about food. And I'm sort of also looking a lot now at the city edge. So if you go to the other side of District 7, to an area called Nha Bay, it's kind of this area that is kind of beginning to be redeveloped. And it's very much on the city edge. And people here are very close to the countryside. They're very close to where their families come from. So they like to live on the city edge because it means they've got access to the countryside, but they've also got access to the city and jobs and more money. So areas like Nha Bay are kind of really interesting because like literally there's one road where on one side of the road is is all these kind of modern developments, and on the other side of the road is very rural. But the interesting thing in Vietnam is the rural is very much like this. The Hem kind of infrastructure is something that's kind of very much a rural. Yeah, should we have a cup of tea? It's very much a rural. There was a story someone was telling me that before they redid all of these Hem laneways, there used to be a drain that ran down the middle, and it was an open drain. What they used to do is block it off and let it fill with water and then put fish in it, so that they had a kind of thing. But obviously now they can't do that because they've buried the drains and trying to kind of modernize and keep it clean. But it's, again, these are kind of stories which I can only get from locals. It's almost impossible for me to dig those stories out of just from being here, because communication is a problem. Come on, you. Thank you. Yeah, walking around with the camera, again, that's kind of why I use my phone, because the phone is a device which most of the locals will be familiar with. They will film their world and their families through their phone. So seeing somebody walking around with a phone is a bit less intimidating than walking around with a big camera. And actually, even walking around with this voice recorder has kind of got a lot more people kind of a bit more concerned and interested in me walking around, because it's something that they're not familiar with. Whereas with a phone, it's a familiar device. So it's good because it kind of it removes that tension, particularly when there's a fear of developers and developers coming in and eyeing up someone's property, and perhaps here there's certainly kind of lots of stories, but maybe the developers here are not quite as morally upstanding as perhaps they should be, and that they will threaten and cajole people, particularly the elderly, to sell up and move for virtually nothing, so that they can redevelop.
Do you want to tell any experience that you had coming here, any anecdotes, positive or negative, or that you...
I've never had a negative one. All my experiences here have been very, very good. I bring students here, and that's kind of enlightening, because the students often live in contexts where they don't live in Hems anymore, or some of them do, but most of them don't. So for them coming here, I have one student who lives just the other side of District 4, lives in District 7, but just on the other side, and has never been here because his family wouldn't let him come here. In fact, when I brought them, a lot of them were saying they had kind of arguments with family to let them come here because of the reputation, which is totally unfounded. I mean, this is, I guess, there's always a rose-tinted glass. I'm a foreigner, so I'm always going to be treated well here. Whereas if I was Vietnamese, it might be a different story. But certainly it works the other way, that you get some quite extraordinary things that some of the students say about people here, kind of working class and a bit looking down on them. In terms of anecdotes here, there's a lovely little, just down here on the left is a lovely Buddhist monastery. And I took Nicholas Boyarsky there once, and they opened up the monastery for us, and it's run by these female monks, and it's an orphanage, so they've got maybe 5 or 6 kids in there that have been orphaned. They invited us in and showed us all around the temple and gave us water and drinks. And so that, generally the experiences here are very good. And the other thing that's really good here is the food. So I really enjoy coming here for particularly seafood. But there's a sort of a bit of a District 4 speciality. It's kind of a wider food, but it's called pha lao, which is basically kind of offal soup, and you have it with a stick of bread, a banh mi they call it, and that's kind of a little bit of a speciality here. Um, Although you do get it across the city, but here they do it really well. And I quite like that, but that's a bit of an acquired taste. That's kind of quite lots of tubes and things that you don't really want to know what they are. I mean, doing this as a PhD has really transformed this. I mean, it has changed my practice quite substantially. It's helped me develop a way to look at how you can film urban spaces, particularly more the qualitative properties of urban spaces, and in a way which is kind of repeatable. And so the process of having to look at this for the PhD has taught me, just the value of re-observing, or this sort of secondary process of observation when you're in a kind of, I guess, a post-production phase of filmmaking, which where you're re-observing because you're thinking about how to recreate or reconstitute the qualitative experience of these hems. Rather than sort of thinking, here's a digital treatment I know how to do and applying it, which is perhaps closer to what I was doing before. I came to filmmaking through kind of by accident, really. I started working with a friend, and we managed to get a very early version of Final Cut. And so we kind of just started making stuff, and we used to do a lot of visuals in clubs and stuff. So it wasn't about making traditional films. It wasn't about storytelling in terms of actually having a script and a predefined story. So my filmmaking process has always been one of kind of just land somewhere and explore, visually explore. So I don't have a traditional approach to filmmaking, and I think that's probably been a real benefit, because I'm here where I can see things that I'm very familiar with, drinking tea, and talking to people, watching people eat, all things that are very, very kind of familiar, but so very, very different, because they're happening in a language and they're happening in a context which I only have a small understanding of, which is a good thing and a bad thing. I really would love to be able to feel like I understand everything here, and I'm trying to discover what my practice is. And I think I've discovered a lot about it, but maybe there's still more to uncover and more to, and place like the Hems, or just filming and working in Ho Chi Minh City or in Vietnam, is giving me a really good opportunity to challenge my understanding of the filmmaking processes, because I cannot film how I think I should be filming. I can only film in a response to the spaces that I'm in, and that's been a really important distinction for me. Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the thesis, I thought, I kind of, in my head, I had a set of treatments that I wanted to work with. And I guess my editing process hasn't changed radically, but it's much more purposeful, and I'm now, I think it's this notion of observation has become very important, but it's also this idea that we just respond to something that is happening at the moment. So my films are a kind of a response to each experience of coming here, which is different. It's different every time. Same streets, same people, but it's different every time. It changes and it shifts, and so each time you come, you're kind of more familiar with the spaces, but perhaps more familiar through the repeat of editing, through this process of reobserving through the editing process. But your familiarity increases, so you come here, which in a way is kind of good, because then when you come here the next time, you're freed up. You're not just overawed, you're actually a bit more in control of the space and context that you're in, which means that you can start looking for more things and you feel more comfortable just walking around and filming. It's that process of discovery and newness and is really valuable. But obviously, the more familiar with it, you don't get as lost as you would have done when you first came. However, I would argue that these spaces always throw up something that is different. Just watching the guys cooking here with the smoke wafting through is something that is kind of very evocative, and but something that I've never filmed before, because that's never been something that I've seen on my visits here. So there's always something that comes up that's new, that makes you rethink and relook. And again, I think that perhaps is a reflection of Vietnam and Vietnamese culture, in terms that it's continually shifting and changing, and it's not this static entity.
Yeah, there is always something that you didn't expect happening or that appears.
So, and those unexpected moments are the bits that are kind of really exciting. And often there'll be things that you see where, or you experience those in the post-production process. So there's a lot of things that I've seen happening in the hems, in these particular hems, that I didn't see at the time that I was here. It's only going through the footage that I begin to see them. Like, for example, one old lady who had a piece of paper rolled up, tucked up underneath a piece of corrugated iron. And it was only when I was going through the footage, probably about 10, 20 times, I noticed this one movement she does, and then I realised she's pulling this piece of paper out, reading it, rolling it back up and putting it back up. I don't know what it was. I assume it's not recipes, because I'm old enough to remember, but maybe it's like a prayer, or maybe, I don't know. It kind of remains a mystery. I think when we look at what's happening here is that we don't know what's happening next. So the future is totally open. Anything can happen. Whereas when you're actually looking at your recorded footage, the destiny of that sequence, of that durational sequence, is a fixed destiny. So perhaps you relax with it and you know what's coming up, but you look for more things. So if you know what's going to happen next, you then start looking at the things around, because you don't necessarily need to see what's happening. So again, it's just this learning process. It's just learning to look at what you're seeing. So now I'm going to go to a more formal presentation where we can look at the sequences that I've edited, and hopefully you'll begin to sort of connect the relationship between being in this context and environment with the kind of the qualitative experience that I've tried to represent through the post-production process. So one of the things that's becoming more important is actually then how I start to work with the films that I've made. So obviously they can exist just purely as films, but what I like to do is, I think this guy might want to come by. What I like to do is to work with using these films in live presentations. So I've been using software to kind of basically live mix the video footage with a colleague of mine who also worked on this original project, who makes audio. So we kind of, he mixes live audio based from the hems, and I mix live footage. And so I think this will be something that I want to kind of pursue, because for me that liveness and that randomness of when you're mixing footage together somehow encapsulates even closer the experience of these particular hems.